All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the brain injury discussion. This is your host, Jay. Today, we are going to be talking about brain nervous system, another part of anatomy. We're talking about information highways and how does the brain act and interact with these information highways. Like always, sources will be in the description below. We'd encourage feedback in the form of a like, maybe a comment. And we'd appreciate it also if you subscribe to the channel. We put out useful, applicable, informational, and educational videos weekly. But with that being said, let's get started. We have a lot of information to cover. So you might have seen these words said about peripheral nervous system or the central nervous system. And you might have heard this in some medical shows. You might see this on medical documentation. You might see this in doctor's notes. Well, if we had to break this down, obviously peripheral, which is the outward of the body, and then we have central, which is inwards. But let's start with the central. The central is where it really all kind of starts, and that is the brain and the spinal cord. And so think about the start of these neuron pathways. Think about where they origin. An injury to the central nervous system is way more damaging because it is where the pathway is. That's think brain, spinal cord, all the way down. And a lot of times you might hear about nerve pain. Well, nerve pain can a lot of the times be started on the central nervous system, which does include the brain. So think about those brain and nerve connections on the spinal cord. We're talking about the highways of information. Information does not just get passed through the body, it has to go through these pathways. And think about it as like the big interstates uh, of information on your body. Also, when we look at the peripheral nervous system, it's away from the brain and the spinal cord. So think about hands, feet, and the ends of those neural pathways. Think about these as the back roads, as the far away from the highway areas. But this is also where you get a lot of sensory and motor function, which require the information to be passed from the brain down the spinal cord through the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system to tell my voice, well, not only my voice, but also my hands what to do, or tell my feet what to do. This is way more complex than just there's a pathway there and there's a signal. How far do I move my leg when I'm walking? How fast do I move my leg when I am walking? How do I maintain balance? An injury to the brain or an injury to any of these systems can cause damage. And, the human body is an amazing thing. We could go on for a lot about anatomy, but without your central and peripheral nervous system, you wouldn't really function because these are the highways that send the information for movement for senses. So when you see central nervous system, think about the brain and think about the spinal cord. But when you see peripheral, think away from those and think about your hands, feet, and everything that connects that to the spine and the brain. And so we're talking a lot here about anatomy. And so think superhighways and then think country back roads, or the exits and then country back roads. As we can see on this graphic here, the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. So that is the central nervous system. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is everything around or emanating from the brain and spinal cord. And so my very poorly drawn description, think about those two differences: an injury to the CNS versus the PNS. You have these different injuries. And so when someone, as an example, has sciatica, this could be caused from a problem with their lower back, like right about there, which connects down to the leg. So they might have that pain going down their leg. But let's take this into the brain injury context, and let's say that there's an injury to the brain here, and maybe the signals are not getting, think about a stroke. The signals aren't going to this side of the body. And so this could be a central nervous system deficit instead of peripheral. But that is just one very brief example. There are tons more that we can go through, and we would be interested in making that video if you guys would like. But let's talk about autonomic nervous systems, the ones that we don't really think about a lot. And this is kind of good to talk about with anatomy and brain injury. So let's start with what is the sympathetic nervous system? Who here has heard of the fight or flight response? Think about, one of the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, it's fight or flight. And so, as we can see here, the purpose is to prepare and react to deliver oxygen flow. With the increased oxygen flow, you're going to get increased function. Think about adrenal endorphins and receptors. Think about adrenaline. We've always heard about people being adrenaline junkies. Well, a large part of adrenaline plays a huge role in stimulating the sympathetic nervous system to fight or flight. And so also think norepinephrine and epinephrine. Think about EpiPens, how it reacts to someone who allergic to bees is getting their EpiPen. Think about what happens to the nervous system when that happens, and some of the effects that we will see in the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system is a dilation of the pupils. That's intaking more detail and light for your eyes. That'd probably be useful in a flight or fight response. Inhibiting saliva. Obviously, you don't want to be, um, spewing out things from your mouth when you're trying to fight. You want to retain that water. Increasing the heartbeat, which means that, okay, yes, we are fighting. I need to get oxygen flow where it needs to go. I need to increase the system. Think about taking a drive and going from maybe 45 to now you're going 70 miles an hour. That is the sympathetic nervous system. Your airways will relax to allow more air in, to allow the greater oxygenation. Stomach activity. Obviously, you don't want to have any issues with your stomach while you're in a fight or flight situation. Same thing goes with increasing the glucose supply in the blood. And so I could go through all of these, but long story short is that all of this is about your brain. Your brain sends these signals to dilate the pupils, to increase the heart rate, to increase the airway, to prevent the stomach from overreacting and increase glucose. There's so much more that can go into talking about this, but that's why I put the resources down below and in the description. That way you can do your own research if you would like. Again, this is a very brief overview, but think fight or flight when you see sympathetic nervous system. It is autonomic, so you physically can't shut it off, or you might be in a situation where it may not be able to be shut off. And same thing goes with brain injury. If you injure the sympathetic nervous system, or your body might react differently if you have a brain injury. But that's only one of the two autonomic nervous systems. Let's continue into the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is known as rest and digest. And so this is the second of the autonomic nervous systems. So you have sympathetic and then you have parasympathetic nervous systems. You have both in you. The purpose is to slow the systems for rest and recovery. Um, Chances are, if you are amped up for a fight or you need to run, you are probably not going to be able to rest. Think about every time that something like a near miss with a car accident, your blood is going, your heart rate's increased, you're breathing heavier. That's not really how you rest. You rest by slowing things down, and rest is very important to the body. And so the parasympathetic nervous system is that rest and digest. There's a bunch of endorphins that can flood your body. Of course, they're controlled by the brain. And what happens is that we see a slowed heart rate, slower, more relaxed breathing. You're not trying to over oxygenate, you're not trying to get more air in. You're not trying to get more air in quicker. You're not trying to get that carbon dioxide quicker. You're just relaxing. And so the parasympathetic nervous system is, again, the second of the two autonomic nervous systems. but it is one of those where, yes, you still require rest and digest, as well as the sympathetic fight or flight. So think parasympathetic, rest and digest. But someone with a brain injury might not have a normal parasympathetic nervous system. And so that kind of leads me to this next slide here. What are the consequences of injury to the nervous system, which includes a big part of the brain? Neurologists have to study the brain. It's not more, it's could be more than just I pinched a nerve. It could be a brain injury. And so what we see is that with injury to the brain and the nervous system is that is usually multifaceted. Okay, it's not just that one area is affected. We could see this as a multitude of different things. And so the way we can look at it as brain injury case managers is we have primary injuries, so point or location of injury. Then we have secondary injuries, additional damage post-injury. The primary would be a good example of, let's take the stroke. The primary injury is, yes, there was ischemia or hemorrhage in the brain, thus oxygen was starved in a certain area of the brain. A secondary injury is more damage post-haste. So think about the seizure after a stroke. Think about the inflammation after a stroke. That's just one example. There's plenty more that we can do. And so the effects of the injuries vary, both primary and secondary, but we should at least know a little bit about anatomy in order to prepare ourselves to deal with these kind of situations. So the physical part, think about that motor movement. Think about someone's ability to move and interact and act. Also think about their sensory abilities, which also impacts how they move and interact. If someone who maybe does not sense that something is there, or maybe they sense that something is there that isn't there, it could be, yes, maybe their eyes have an injury to the optic nerve, which part of the brain, and maybe there's an injury to their hearing. Maybe there's other injuries that affect the way they sense things. And so that could affect other things like their motor movements. Also, think about psychological. Again, we talk about fight or flight, rest and digest, central and peripheral nervous systems, but also think about maybe someone's emotional response. Maybe they're quick to get angry. Maybe they have a short fuse. That could be their fight or flight response. And think about their behavioral aspects. Maybe they're inhibiting. Maybe they're discombobulating. Maybe they are confusing things. Could be because their rest and digest system is flooded, or maybe they're tired, maybe they're fatigued, and maybe the rest and digest is kicking in, maybe when an inopportune time. And so think about that. Also, their cognitive abilities could be affected. Think about that executive functioning and that memory. Maybe they are in that fight or flight response, and so their memory is jumping to the worst thing possible, like the worst case scenario. Maybe their executive functioning might not be at 100% because they've had a frontal lobe injury, and thus it manifests in kind of different ways. And so the reaction of brain injury can be varied by a long shot from extreme to very minor. And so, knowing this, what does this lead me as a brain injury case manager to conclude? Well, knowledge, it helps us understand the changes we need to know and continue to learn. I do not know everything about the brain, the spinal cord, the parasympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous systems, or even all the autonomous functions of the brain. And learning helps me understand these things. Again, brain injury can be multifaceted. Maybe it is affecting both their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, or maybe it's manifesting as something that is peripheral, but really it's a central nervous system problem. Who knows? I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a neurologist, but I can at least better educate myself to ask the right questions, especially if you're a brain injury case manager. It helps me understand the changes, and maybe I can break that down for the client or for the person with a brain injury to a way that they understand. Also, Anatomy will explain some of the effects on the brain injury. Knowing what a stroke does to the central nervous system helps explain the parasympathetic nervous system. Well, maybe they're tired. But if I know there's a difference in general overview of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, well, then I can kind of put two and two together and help explain a stroke to maybe a family member, maybe someone they're working with, maybe someone else that might not know as much. It also helps me explain that, yes, maybe this person is in a fight or flight response right now because his norepinephrine's going, maybe his epinephrine's going, maybe this is this person's new baseline. And so there's a lot to consider. Also, probably my most important point on this is we do need to consider the injury, but we need to understand the whole person. Again, we sometimes will overlook the person. And, unfortunately, sometimes people are considered a number. We need to understand the whole person. We need to make sure that they are a person and more than just a number. And so when we understand the injury, we tend to understand the behavior and the person and the cognitive and the executive functioning. We tend to understand those factors, but we should not forget at all that this person is still a person. They are more than a number. They are more than just an injury. They're more than just a stack of paperwork. No, this is a whole person who has had a brain injury. But I believe that'll conclude it for this video. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And here are my references. They will be in the description below. Um, Feel free to take a look at these to get a more in-depth analysis of what these autonomic and peripheral and central nervous systems do. I would encourage you to do that. There is a ton of good information in these, and I always encourage people to please, we want to see ideas. If you have a topic or a brain injury that you want us to cover, we'd gladly do that. Even if it is obscure, we will do the research and provide you answers. Um, but with that being said, I hope everyone likes, subscribes, and comments on this video. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, but don't forget, protect those brains.